this is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you my wrap-up for the month of August. Now, I read only 5 things in August, which seems really disappointing for me. I usually read more than 5 things in a month, but a couple of them are things that I think is going to be some work for me to talk about here, so I am still a little daunted by this wrap-up. The first thing I finished in the month is one of those, and it is Tigana by Guy Gavriel Kay. I read this for the read-along on Goodreads that Katie from Katie Loves to Read was hosting over the month of July. I got most of the way through it in July and then finished it at the beginning of August. I was participating in the sort of chapter-by-chapter discussions that were happening over there, and if you're interested in reading what some of the people in that group are having to say as we read it, I will link that group for you and you can read all of our discussions. So this is a chunker of a fantasy novel that takes place on a peninsula that's meant to be sort of the fantasy world equivalent of Italy, but the provinces of the peninsula of the Palm, which all used to be independently governing, have been conquered by 2 different sorcerer tyrants. One from the east and one from the west, splitting the Palm down the middle. One of these sorcerer tyrants is operating on behalf of the king of, I think it's called Barbadior, back home, and that is Alberico. And the other one is the actual king of Igrath, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and that is Brandon. Brandon has established a secondary court here in the Palm as part of his personal vendetta against one of the provinces, Tigana, for the death of his son. When Brandon conquered Tigana, he absolutely devastated the province, and he magically erased the province's name. It now goes by Lower Corte. And no one who was not born there can hear the name Tigana or remember that it had that name and this rich cultural history. There are enough twists and reveals starting really early on in this book that I'm not sure I can explain a whole lot of the main arc of the plot without giving some of those away, so I'm not really going to accept to say that this is basically about a revolutionary group with the intent to bring back Tigana, with an understanding that the 2 tyrants of the Palm are at a standstill, so if you take down one, the other will just conquer the other half of the Palm, and so this revolution for Tigana is also inevitably tied up with freedom for the Palm as a whole. I'm going to have to spend a lot of time trying to explain the thing I didn't like about this book because it's very subtle and it's very hard to pin down. So I want to be very clear before I start on that overall I really liked this book and I gave it 4 stars. There's a lot of really spot on good political stuff, a lot to do with identity and cultural erasure, a lot to do with the arts. This was actually something that I was expecting I was going to like about Guy Gavriel Kay from what I've heard about him, and I actually did like it a lot. This story hinges in several ways on the political importance of the arts. A group of the main characters are traveling musicians, and we see how much that music means to them and why. You also get a view of how the 2 tyrants view the arts differently and what that means for them. Alberico doesn't understand the importance of the arts, and so he persecutes some poets, and then he gets more rebellious poetry and it doesn't work out. Brandon understands that patronage of the arts can do wonders for him, but he also understands how dangerous the arts are, and so he has demolished the entire artistic and cultural traditions, say, of Tigana. There is some really interesting mythology in this book and some beliefs and traditions that are based on real historical things that are really cool. I also really like that for an epic fantasy story, very little of the book itself was focused on actual battle or action scenes. That's pretty much reserved for a very small portion of the book near the end. This is a personal preference thing for me. I don't like reading a lot of battle or action scenes. Where I got kind of uncomfortable, and it took a lot of thinking for me to figure out what exactly was making me uncomfortable about this, but it was some of the things to do with the women and some weird sex stuff in this book that I didn't think really needed to be there. While I was reading this, it occurred to me that I think that most of the books I read these days that have significant amounts of sexual content are written by women, and so I sort of identify as the discomfort I was feeling as being sort of a male gaze thing. I know that I have read fantasy novels that are way more sexist than this one. On the other hand, I read an incredible amount of fantasy written by women, and there were a lot of things that happened in this book, a lot of things that happened to the female characters in this book, a lot of the ways they were used in the narrative, that I just don't see female authors doing with their characters, and so they start to rub me the wrong way just because I do read so much fantasy that doesn't do these things. The character who seems to be, I think, the primary main character in the book is a young singer named Devin. He ends up getting caught up in this rebellion. He isn't like a specifically very important character in the story, except that he's sort of the lens through which we see the whole thing. I kind of like that form of storytelling, where the main character is kind of an observer. But there is this weird thing with Devin that I think other people in the group were commenting on as well, where basically everyone wants to have sex with him, and none of us can figure out why. Like, he doesn't seem that attractive. I just don't get it. But aside from Devin, let's talk about the female characters a bit. I'm referring a bit to things that I wrote in the Goodreads group when I was partway through the book, but I'm also going to talk about sort of my overall takeaway having gotten to the end. What feels really hard for me about trying to call some of this stuff out is because you can tell that Guy Gavriel Kay was really putting effort into trying to put strong female characters into this book, and I liked some of these characters a lot. So, first of all, while several of the central characters in the book are women, none of the major power figures in the political saga are. Like, I know it's supposed to be based on a time period where women don't have a bunch of power, but there is plenty of historical fiction out there from all time periods about women shaping history, so don't give me that. The closest we have to a woman with real power is the character of Dianora, who is one of the major characters of this book. But she is technically a slave. She is in something called the Saishan, which is basically the equivalent of a harem at Brandon's court. She has a lot of sway with Brandon, and she is allowed to pull the strings of the court a bit. But it's very explicitly clear that she only has the illusion of power and not the true thing. And also, Dianora's relationship with Brandon, like, I'm still not sure how I feel about it. She is from Tigana and arranged to get herself to court with the intention of killing Brandon and liberating Tigana, but like 15 years later, she hasn't had the heart to do it because she loves him so much. And of course, that relationship is way more complex than that. It's a long book, there's a whole lot to it. But it's all like a little ooky to me that she's supposed to be like the powerful woman in this story. And one of the things that struck me that it wouldn't have occurred to a female author not to do, if that makes any sense, is that Dianora doesn't have any meaningful female friendships within the Saishan. Instead, it is all rivalry over the man who enslaved them. And I think it's the sort of thing that honestly didn't occur to the author when he was writing this character. And I think that it's something that's not supposed to occur to the reader, because we're supposed to just sort of accept that this is how it is, but it stood out to me. The other major female character is a member of the rebel group, but we all noticed in the Goodreads group that she sort of isn't allowed to actually do anything as a member of this rebel group, even though she's like ostensibly there as the strong female character who, like, look, this rebel group isn't sexist because they have a girl here who's one of them and they treat her like one of them. But she doesn't actually like really participate in any of the things that they do as a rebel group over the course of the story, and it's very strange. When Devin joins this group with no fighting experience, he's a singer after all, they give him a sword and teach him to fight, and there's this, moment where he makes his first kill and he feels all torn about it. But it doesn't seem like she was given the same. It doesn't seem like she has been taught any combat skills. It doesn't seem like she has any combat skills should she need them. There's also a scene where, like, the group is staging this scene in a tavern, and she doesn't participate in that either, possibly because women don't go into taverns in this world. I don't know if that was explicitly stated, but I don't think we ever saw any women in any taverns. One of the members of their group is ostensibly like this master of disguise, and he's able to disguise everyone in the group so that they look all like totally different. Why didn't she get to cross-dress? Like, that's what I want to know. We have all of these extreme disguises, including blackface of all things, but no cross-dressing. If I were the author, I would have cross-dressing, but no blackface. There is also a minor character who actually is sort of in the position of a woman in power. She's a widow, she has her own estate, but she's a dominatrix. And I think maybe the less said about her, the better. There's actually a moment where she, like, knocks on Devon's door in the middle of the night, and me, a fantasy reader trained on female authors, read that scene and thought, like, oh my gosh, this is gonna be fun because he's gonna think that she's coming to him for kinky sex. But she's actually gonna have, like, some sort of political scheming going on, and it's going to be some sort of midnight emergency. And I'm finally going to get to laugh at Devon for assuming that everyone wants to have sex with him. But no. Kinky sex. There are a couple of minor female characters in this that I actually really liked, and they got some moments that were just great, but I thought those were too few and too far between. Also, having gotten to the end of the book, and I don't want to spoil anything, so this is going to be hard, but there's a sort of theme with the two major female characters of, like, symbolic, repeated, attempted suicides. Like, there is definitely a suicide theme that's, like, foreshadowed and then repeated and then, like, repeated a third time and then a fourth time that is very clearly, for some reason, linked to the female characters of this book and not the male characters. And I don't know why. So that took a really long time. You do have to kind of take my word for it. I think that I really did like this book. I enjoyed reading it. I gave it 4 stars on Goodreads. And I really liked participating in the read-along. I'm a little torn on whether or not I'll read more Guy Gavriel Kay anytime soon, though. I might look to see what he's written that's more recent than this and see if his treatment of female characters has improved over time. The next thing I read I already have a review of, so I'm not going to talk about it in depth here, but that is Girls Made of Snow and Glass by Melissa Bashardoust. This was a NetGalley ARC that I got. It is a YA standalone Snow White retelling. I will link my review for you so you can check it out. In summary, I really liked this retelling's take on the fairy tale. It's challenging the assumption that the stepmother and the princess have to inevitably be rivals. But I thought the writing was kind of underwhelming and lacking in polish or maybe style, if that means anything. I gave it 3 stars. Please check out my review if you'd like to hear more. And then Tome Topple happened in the month of August. I had a kind of ambitious TBR, but I only ended up reading 1 book from it. It turned out I was also reading other things during Tome Topple that weren't my Tome Topple books. One of them being finishing up Tigana, which I actually finished during the Tome Topple period, but since that wasn't one of my Tome Topple books, and that was a book that I had mostly read the previous month, I'm not counting it. But the book that I did read for Tome Topple was Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. I loved this. I'm not sure it's going to be for everyone, and I'm not sure I'm going to like the second book in this duology as much once it comes out, but I absolutely loved this book. This is YA, but again, it's a very full and fleshed out fantasy book that does not hinge on action or battle scenes, which is refreshing for me to find in YA because I don't find that as much as I want to. This book has 2 point of view characters. The main protagonist, I think, of this book is Laszlo Strange, who is the dreamer of the title. He's a librarian in a fantasy world, and, like, I'm a sucker for fantasy librarians. And the early chapters of this book, like, hooked me. Absolutely 100%. Laszlo is deeply obsessed with records of this long-lost fantastical city that's steeped in legend and myth and fairy tale. He's someone that I think fantasy readers are meant to identify with very strongly, because he has like this incredible imaginative inner landscape that is fed by, you know, reading obscure things in dusty corners. This city, now known as Weep, is kind of like Tigana, a city that has magically lost its name somehow, so it was interesting reading this book right on the heels of that one. But it's a city that outsiders were never allowed to enter. Long ago, its connection with the rest of the world was cut off. But eventually Laszlo gets this far-flung chance to join a group traveling to Weep to see if experts from the outside world can solve Weep's problem, which is not going to get explained to them until they get there. The other point of view is a girl named Sarai. She is one of a small handful of teenagers with blue skin and magical powers who are living alone in an abandoned citadel for reasons that I think are best left mysterious. But while Laszlo is a dreamer in the sense of waking dreams, fantasies, imagination, wanting impossible things, Sarai's magic has to do with literal dreams that happen while you sleep. I am a sucker for like magical dream stuff in books, especially when it's like richly and lavishly written, which is basically what Laini Taylor does as an author, is rich and lavishly written fantasy. There is like lots of lucid dreaming and extravagant dreamscapes in this book, and I ate it up. Now, the reason I say that I'm not necessarily expecting to like the second book in this duology quite as much is because this ended with like a holy crap, things are about to get bad moment. And I expect that book 2 will be like the book where all the stuff goes down, which is fine. I expect that in a series. For me, I tend to be more attracted to this sort of part of any story arc where we're setting the scene and everything's gorgeous. And there is like heartbreak and tragedy, but like everything's still a mystery. Second book could surprise me, I have no idea, but I'm expecting it to be more action driven. I also want to point out, because I don't think anyone else has mentioned it, there is something that is referenced in this book that makes me think that there is a connection between this series and something from the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy. This is not set in the same world, but both seem to have references to travel between worlds that seem to align. And I am curious to see if that's going to end up being significant in the course of this story, or if it's just an Easter egg for fans of the first trilogy. I gave Strange the Dreamer 5 stars because I ate it up like candy. The next book that I read was much shorter. This is one of the Tor.com books. This is Passing Strange by Ellen Klages. This is mostly historical fiction with a little bit of magic. It also features a couple of characters who are in some of this author's short stories that I've read, and I enjoyed seeing those two characters again, even though they were in supporting roles. Now, this takes place in 1940 in San Francisco and follows a community friend group of queer women, and it's looking at the cultural and legal issues surrounding being a lesbian woman in that time and place. There's also a bit of an intersectional look at racism and Orientalism. One of the characters in this is a Japanese-American woman who people assume is a Chinese foreigner because she works in Chinatown as an exotic dancer. But that character, Helen, is actually the character we start out with here. We meet her as an old woman, knowing that she's about to die from something we don't really know what, but it's medical, bringing this painting that she has in her possession to this kind of scammy used book dealer in order to sell it. It's the painting sort of depicted on the cover here, but it's by an artist known as Haskell, who is known for having done erotic pulp magazine covers. And this is Haskell's mysterious lost final painting. The assumption that Helen lets the used bookseller run with is that Haskell was a man. We flash back to the main body of this story. It turns out, no, she was a queer woman. And this is a love story with a little bit of fantasy that has a magical ending that's kind of ambiguous ambiguous. It can be, I think, interpreted in some different ways. Anyways, I thought this was lovely even when it got a little sad, and I gave it 4 stars. And then the last thing I read in August was an interlibrary loan, and it was what took up the majority of my reading time during the month, because even though it was not long, it was really dense reading. And that was Fairy Tale in the Ancient World by Graham Anderson. This was a group read for a Goodreads group that I'm a member of. The group is called Into the Forest. I'll link it below. We were reading things that had won or been nominated for the Mythopoeic Award, which is an award that has both fiction and nonfiction categories, so this was the nonfiction pick. This is incredibly academic writing in terms of fairy tale scholarship, and it's not something that I think is even necessarily meant to be read like cover to cover. It's more a thing to be used for reference, I would say, but I'm still really glad that I did plow through and manage to read all of it, even if I didn't have time to go chasing down references, so I wasn't always 100% sure what I was reading about. So basically the premise is that fairy tale type storytelling and story elements are actually universal and go way back into the ancient world. It's not a modern phenomenon. So there are attempts to draw connections between various modern being anything newer than ancient, fairy tale story types, and a variety of texts and sources from the ancient world, most of which I was unfamiliar with. Honestly, I was unfamiliar with a lot of the modern fairy tale variants referenced too, so there's that. Since I had this as an interlibrary loan, I did not have time to go Googling what everything was that was mentioned, like 5 things per page, and Anderson doesn't give a lot of context. I think he's assuming that if this is important to you, you will either know it or you will find it out. But what this did do a really good job of for me was sort of breaking down preconceived notions of what constitutes a fairy tale or folk tale. What does it mean for something to fall into that story category? I will say going into this, I was glad I knew about the Arne Thompson classification system for fairy tales. I think if I didn't, I would have been totally at sea, because he's basically chapter by chapter addressing stories by Arne Thompson type and identifying what the story elements of that tale type are and where they show up in these miscellaneous documents from classical times, some of which are, things that you would recognize, but others of which are fragments from who knows where. And he'll make these charts of different stories or versions of a story and mark out which elements are present in each one. But he didn't really do a great job of describing what the actual plot was of each of those variants described. And he does start with some more recognizable story types like Snow White, Cinderella, etc. Then he gets into some more obscure ones, and some of them I wasn't familiar with at all. But the thing about addressing fairy tales by tale type like this is that the focus really is on how the story works, and the things that we as casual readers might recognize as the elements of a fairy tale aren't actually the things that make a version of that story a version of that story in a fairy tale scholarship sense. So something like a glass slipper, which we recognize, a glass slipper means this is Cinderella. What it really takes to be a story of that type is an object that confirms the identity of the bride. And if a story has enough of the other elements of the tale type in it, then it might not even need the object to confirm the identity of the bride for it to fall under that story type category. And some of those elements might be things that we as casual fairy tale readers will recognize as an element from a popular version of that fairy tale, and some of them might just be things that keep cropping up in all of these really obscure versions that someone like me has never even heard of. In terms of establishing an argument that these sorts of stories existed in antiquity, Anderson kind of deconstructs texts that might generally be considered to be myth or might generally be considered to be literature, and it's often kind of making the argument that they might be reflecting story elements that might have popularly existed in, say, an oral tradition at the time. I'm gonna say I was hoping that it was going to have a more global approach in terms of the modern fairy tales that he's talking about. He's mostly talking about European modern fairy tales, and in terms of texts from antiquity, he's talking as a classics scholar about things from what's sort of considered to be the Western classical world, but since that's centered around the Mediterranean, it includes like some of North Africa and the Middle East. I was hoping for a little more of a global approach, and I didn't get it. I still think I got a lot out of this because I'm thinking about fairy tales, stories, differently now than I was before I was reading it, and I'm recognizing those story elements discussed cropping up in more things that I read. But I didn't have the interlibrary loan long enough to get, I think, full value out of this book. I didn't even get to read the appendices, which talked about several other completely different story types. So overall, not particularly accessible, but it made me more excited to read more fairy tale scholarship, because like if I now know I can get through something this dense and get value out of it, I'm pretty sure there are other things I could read and get value out of too. Anyhow, I did not give Fairy Tale in the Ancient World a star rating because I don't think I'm qualified to give a rating to this sort of book. This isn't that sort of book for me. Anyhow, that's what I read in August. Maybe not a lot of books, but I think some really meaty stuff. Let me know how your reading month was in August, and I guess in September too if you want to. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.